When Alastair Campbell was just 28, he got a dream promotion. News editor at a leading British tabloid. It was a high-pressure, high-stress job, and he loved it. Alastair was at the top of his game, covering the biggest stories in the UK, but then he found himself in the middle of a park in Scotland, having a psychotic breakdown. And he thought it was the end of his marriage, end of his career. But Alastair Campbell went on to become a formidable presence inside number 10 Downing Street. As Tony Blair's press secretary, he was a key player during critical moments in history: the end of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, the death of Princess Diana, and the Iraq War. But all the while, behind the scenes, he struggled with depression. Alastair's now a mental health advocate, an author, and a co-host of the hugely successful podcast, The Rest is Politics. I'm Mark Scott, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sydney, and this is The Solutionists. Alastair, welcome. Take me back to the 1980s. You were working at the Mirror newspaper and then at the Today newspaper, climbing the ranks. Reflect on those times. What was it like to be a journo in that tabloid era?
Well, I loved it, actually. I think the great thing about being a journalist in any era is that your job is really just to kind of ask people questions and have conversations. And I used to think there was a story in anybody, and there was.
Yeah.
It was pretty wild. You mentioned the breakdown I had. I think part of that was driven by alcohol, and it was a very alcohol culture. It was actually quite a friendly place, even though there was a lot of backstabbing in terms of between newspapers. Within the newspaper, there was a sense of a team. Yeah. But it was kind of defining for me because as you say, I was a bit of a high flyer, and then I suddenly crashed and burned, and I thought it was all over. But yeah, I don't think about it that. I think about my breakdown a lot. I don't think about my journalism that much.
Yeah.
But when I do think about it, I think of it very fondly.
Yeah. Do you miss it?
Well, I kind of do journalism in a different way. I do both journalism and politics in a different way now. I write a lot. The podcast is a form of journalism. I write a lot of books, which I think are, again, using the journalistic skills. Funny enough, I wrote a book last year called But What Can I Do?, which is about the need to get more people engaged in politics. And I got an approach by a publisher saying, would I do a version for young kids? Which I've now written, but it was interestingly, I think my tabloid training skills really helped with it, because trying to explain really complicated political issues in like a sentence or 10 words, they'd say like, try that in 15 words. So I learned a lot doing journalism, but I think one of the things I've always had is a sense of curiosity, and I think that's what journalism is about, really. You've got to be curious about the world.
We've referenced 1986. You're on the trail of Neil Kinnock, the Labor leader. You said you've been drinking a lot, you were juggling a high-pressure job, and it all boils over. How do you reflect on that day? What happened on that day?
Oh, God, I've made films about this and written whole books about it. Well, the day started in a hotel room where I'd gone to the hotel because Fiona, my partner, and I, we'd fallen out. I'd been drinking all day, and I ended up in the hotel, emptying the minibar, and I woke up kind of in my own vomit, basically. But I had to get to Scotland. So because Neil Kinnock was speaking at the Scottish Labour Party conference. So I got to Heathrow, bought a new suit, bought a new shirt, bought a new tie, went to the gents and sort of washed myself and got sorted out. And then just as the day wore on, I felt weirder and weirder and weirder, really wired. I think the moment when I knew it was going really a bit crazy, I hired a car and I was driving to this place and I got in this roundabout and I couldn't get off the roundabout. I was going around hundreds of times and I just couldn't turn off the roundabout. Eventually I did. I went to this place, I dumped the car. I went, if you're going to have a breakdown, try not to have it in a top secret secure naval dockyard, right? But I went into this naval base and I went through the entrance and I said, listen, that's my car out there. I can't drive it anymore. Here's the keys. Here's the number. I think there was some kind of weird espionage operation, right? Anyway, so I just dumped the car. I then got a taxi. I'd lost Neil Kinnock by now. He'd moved on. So I'm now panicking. I'm seeing, and then I start to see things and I'm not quite sure what's real, what's not. And then by the end of the day, I was having a full-blown psychotic breakdown. I was hearing voices. I was seeing things that weren't there. Some of them were there, but you couldn't work out what was real and what wasn't. And eventually I got arrested. I was emptying my pockets. I was emptying this bag that I had. I think I was about to take my clothes off. And these two policemen, plain clothes, who were special branch looking after Neil, they came up and said, "Listen, are you all right?" And I said, "I don't think I am, you know." And they took me away. I look back now as it was the best thing that ever happened to me.
Why is that?
Because I sorted myself out afterwards.
Yeah.
I rebuilt myself. I did think my life was over. I thought I'm finished in my career. I thought Fiona's going to leave me. In fact, the next day she and her dad flew up, and it was obvious she wasn't going to leave me. So I kind of understood that I couldn't blow that again. I stopped drinking. I didn't touch alcohol for the next 13 years. And I rebuilt myself. And I just think everything I've done since then, all the stuff that's been difficult, like, you know, working in government, running campaigns, taking a lot of crap from the media, all that stuff, I don't think I could have done it without that experience, because it gave me this yardstick. It didn't matter to me that people were saying all sorts of stuff, because I thought, listen, I've had worse than this.
And is coming back from that the hardest thing you've ever had to do?
I don't know about that. Funny enough, I think that, as you asked the question, I think the hardest thing I had to do was many years later when I saw my son going through something very similar. Because I felt with that even though I'd been through a similar experience, I just felt I wasn't handling it well. So that was hard. Watching your son kind of descend into alcoholism was really hard. He's 11 years dry now, so, you know, we kind of got through it, but that was hard. And then I think I didn't find it hard at the time, because I had this, look, I know Australians love their cricket. I had this thing where I was counting every day as a run. And at the end of the day, I was climbing into bed and saying, "Oh, it's he gets another run there. He's now on 6,418. I was literally counting the days. And it was just like I don't know, once I'd made the switch in my mind, I'm going to sort myself out, I didn't find it that difficult. I didn't find stopping drinking as difficult as I thought I would. A lot of people find that really hard. And then the next thing that happened was that essentially I realised that the alcohol and the work were probably both addictions that I was using to cover up the reasons for the addictions, which was the depression. And I didn't really get that fixed until after I left Downing Street, to be honest, because I'd convinced myself I'd done all the hard yards by stopping drinking, and that was me fixed. But it wasn't.
There's more work to be done.
Yeah.
Let's talk about getting into politics, because, you know, once you stopped drinking, your career flourished again. You ended up political editor of a newspaper, and then you made the decision to move into politics. I've heard many journalists talk about moving to the dark side. How tough a decision was that to you, to leave journalism to join politics in 1994?
Leaving journalism wasn't that tough, because, I mean, look, if I hadn't had the offer, if Tony Blair hadn't said to me I'd want to come and work with me, I probably would have carried on being a journalist. But I was getting a bit tired of journalism. Too much of the stuff I was doing was coming around again. It was the same
You'd
sort
seen it
of
all
stuff.
before. Yeah.
Well, it just felt quite repetitive. And I think also I was conscious of the fact that the media landscape was changing, I think, for the worse. This whole kind of, you know, the Murdochization of our press. I mean, that had already happened, but I think once it got into television as well, I think our media became a pretty bad place. And so I didn't find it that hard, but actually I said no for a month. Tony Blair asked me repeatedly, and I said, no, I'm not going to do it. And the main reason I said no was partly because of the breakdown. I thought, well, you know, I've cracked up before, and this is going to be way worse pressure than being a journalist. But also Fiona, my partner, my parents, Neil Kinnock, all saying, don't do it, don't do it. But something in me, I sort of knew I would do it when he asked me, but I took a long time to say yes.
Dance around to finally saying yes.
Yeah.
You know, you speak very openly about your breakdown. You talk about, you know, being worried would things be triggered again. Was the fact that you'd had that experience, and that experience really in kind of quite a public way, was that an issue in taking a job that led you to Downing Street? Were you as open about it?
I was, there? Yeah, and actually, I think it could have been an issue, but when I first said, Tony, we were on holiday in France, and I'd said to Tony, okay, I'm going to think about it over a holiday. Just don't pester me. I'm going to think about it. So we went off on holiday, as it happens with the Kinnocks. I mean, it's amazing how the same people weave in and out of your life. And so we were on holiday in France, And I get a phone call from Tony saying, "Oh, we're only 5 hours away. We'll pop in tomorrow."
Popping down.
Yeah, we're going to pop down and see you. And of course, he came to try and talk me into doing the job, which I did. And his mother-in-law, there was him, his wife, his mother-in-law, and his three kids. And his mother-in-law had to go to Marseille. So we drove her down to Marseille. And on the way back, Tony and I had a kind of proper chat and stuff. And I said, "Tony, I want to go through everything that I've done in my past, that's happened to me in my past, that could become a problem." Okay, so I went through all sorts of stuff. The fact that I'd written pornography, the fact that I used to get involved in fights at university and nearly got kicked out, all sorts of stuff. And then the breakdown. And I told him in detail. I said, "Look, I know you know."
You're layering them one on another. Well, if that doesn't throw you, let me.
Yeah,
let me
here's
show you
another
the
one.
next
Here's
yeah.
another one. And I'm thinking several things. The main thing I'm thinking is there enough kind of stuff in here that the media decide to get into it, and he thinks, "Oh, this is just too tricky." So I just laid it all out in the line. And I told him about the breakdown, and I was describing it in detail. And I remember there was this bit where I was saying to him, so at one point, my brain's exploding. I've got this, inside my head feels like a glass sort of building that's shattering. And I'm covering my face with my hands because I can't work out why there's no blood, because inside there's all this glass shattering. And then suddenly Elvis Presley starts singing, there's a bit of ABBA, and then Fiona starts shouting at me, and then there's an argument going on in the office, and he was looking at me like, he really did look like quite worried. But then he said, "Well, look, that's all right. I'm not bothered if you're not bothered." And I said, what if I'm bothered? He said, "I'm still not bothered." So, and I always say when I'm talking about this, leadership in employment is so important.
Yeah.
You know, because he could easily have thought, "Oh, this is a bit tricky."
I've often thought when it comes to recruitment that it's really just a great act of trust, isn't it? You're really trusting them. Why do you think he trusted you when you lay all those stories in front of him?
I think because he knew me quite well, and he hadn't known me in that period, but he knew me quite well, and he thought, "What I've seen in this guy, I think I need it." And he said, in fact, in that time in France, he said, "Look, you know, this is going to be really tough. We're going to have really good people, and I've got loads of good people who are very good at tactics. He said, but I think you've got a very strategic mind, and that's what I need. I need people with strategic minds." And you know, so I don't know. And then, but I think also there is a skill, I think, in recruitment and in leadership, which is about being able genuinely to assess people's character. When there might be a lot of noise around them and other people might have judgment. I think Tony did have a very good. I mean, the team that we built was pretty impressive, and I think he had a really good sense of what people's qualities were and how enduring they could be.
And so you work with him. He wins government. How do you find the pressure that you're worried about? You know, when you work in the Prime Minister's office in such a 24/7 world.
I mean, I never felt I was cracking up. I did feel stress. I think I learned the difference between pressure and stress. I like pressure. I like being under pressure, but I don't like stress. I don't like feeling when you feel I'm not in control here. But pressure, I like. And I think the other thing is you have to have the ability to. I'm not good at switching off, but I did have the ability to. You know, if I'm focusing on half a dozen things at once, I was able to focus on them one at a time, so that I wasn't kind of just having this chaos.
A sequential focusing on the issue of the moment.
Absolutely. So, and in a funny sort of way, the job helped with that because, you know, part of the job, I mean, I was his spokesman and press secretary and director of strategy, and I guess because the spokesman bit meant contact with the media, I think they thought was the most important part of my job. It wasn't really. I used that part of the job to strategize more. So every morning when I did a briefing with the media, I had to be on top of absolutely everything. Anything that I might get asked about, I had to be on top of it. In getting on top of it, I was kind of working out, I hope, where real problems were and real challenges were and where we had to sort of make the next steps. That was what I was trying to do.
You kept a diary, which you've published. Then you look at that diary, you think there are a lot of days you didn't seem too thrilled with the world.
No, that's true.
So reflect back on it now. Was it a great time? Was it worth it for you? Were you happy doing it?
Oh, it's really interesting you say that because if you'd have said to me at the time, I'd have said, "Oh, loving it, round peg in a round hole. This is what I was made for." But then when I read the diaries back, when I transcribed the diaries, I couldn't believe how often I was like clearly depressed. Started off, woke up, felt shit, went to bed, felt shit. It was like, and then through the day, this was awful, that was awful. Oh God, why did he do that? Why did she do that? Why did I do that? So looking back, I'm very, very, very happy that I did it. But I recognise I probably wasn't very happy a lot of the time doing it. And I think the other thing that happens in those jobs is you absorb so much of other people's pressure. And then I think the thing I really do regret, I think you then pile it on to the other people, particularly your family probably.
Family in the office too?
A little bit, but I had a really good team in the office. I think I think I did pile it onto them, but in a way that they saw that as part of their job as well.
I want to move on to the political landscape more broadly now, but just back to two issues that you had to deal with that I think generated so much attention at the time. One was you being called in to help out the royal family at the time of the death of Diana. How did you engage at that point to help them deal with that crisis and the rigidity of the image that the world was watching, that they were projecting?
Well, that was a fascinating kind of few days because I was in bed in London. Tony was in bed in Sedgefield. In fact, famously they had to get a copper to go and wake him up because he didn't have a phone on, he didn't have an alarm clock, my phone rang, middle of the night. In fact, the first I heard of it was a pager message in the days of pagers. So my pager went off, and it said, something like car crash in Paris, Dodie dead, Diana seriously injured. This is not a joke. Okay, so I phoned the office, and anyway, it was pretty clear fairly soon that she was dead. But in terms of helping them, what happened was when the body was flown back the next day, or later that day, because it was the early hours by then. When the body was flown back, the palace, said that Tony as Prime Minister should go, and Charles was there, and other members of the royal household were there. I think other ministers were there, and so I went. I actually went separately, but obviously it was, I was by then talking to Tony the whole time about how we're handling this and how we're handling that, and he had a conversation with Lord Airlie, who was the head of the royal household, and they both called me over, and Airlie said, look, we've got every funeral planned for the royals. If the Queen died tomorrow, we know what to do. If Charles dies, but Diana is not a royal anymore, so we're going to need help on this. And now they know, because they knew me when I was a journalist, and I'm not the biggest monarchist.
Not the biggest fan. Yeah.
No. And yet, so there we were for the next few days. I was in the palace as much as I was in Number 10. And actually it was really good. The engagement was really good. I think we were very sensitive to their issues. Not sure if they were quite as sensitive to our issues, because in their world it didn't matter as much. We were conscious of the fact that the right-wing media in particular was gagging to say Tony Blair's trying to take this whole thing over. So it was quite a tricky kind of balancing act. But it was it was an incredible week. And the end of it, this in funerals in our own lives, that sometimes you have a death and then there's all sorts of awful, terrible drama, and then the funeral brings a kind of closure, and it really felt like that for the but on this massive global scale, yeah.
A lot of the pressure on the Blair government began to unravel with the Iraq War, and you were involved in putting together a document that made the case for the weapons of mass destruction. But then the Blair government was accused of exaggerating the evidence, and the BBC reported that the weapons inspector, David Kelly, said the report had been sexed up, and within a week, David Kelly took his own life. You've reflected in your podcast, looking back on that time. How do you reflect back on your decision-making and the issues you were dealing with?
It was interesting, because when we did it was on the anniversary that Rory Stewart said, look, I think we should talk about Iraq, and I think we should do it in some detail. We ended up doing, it's the only time we've done 2 episodes on, just without stopping. And it's interesting, because even Fiona, my partner, she said after she listened, she said, God, I've never ever heard you talk about Iraq like that before. And I said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, I just haven't. I felt I was saying things that I've said 1,000 times. But I think what was happening was I was being more reflective. I mean, look, deep down, I wish it had never happened. But at the same time, I can still defend the decisions that Tony Blair made at the time. And I do still get very, very angry that, you know, the whole Tony Blair thing, the fact that I get labelled as having sort of manipulated intelligence when I know I didn't, the fact that I mean, there's not a single day, literally not a single day, in fact, there's not a single tweet I do that somebody in reply doesn't post a picture of David Kelly. Or doesn't call me a war criminal or whatever it might be. And again, I go back to the thing about the resilience that you build through something like having had a breakdown. That sort of helps you get through it. But I found it was a horrible, horrible, horrible period, no doubt about that. And you know, I said in my diaries on the day that David Kelly's body was found, I phoned Tony. I said, listen, I want out. I can't do this anymore. I can't do it. And Tony talked me into staying for a bit. I was already trying to leave anyway because I was kind of slightly at the end of my tether. So I reflected on the policy. I reflect in this way. I basically think that I still support the decision based upon what Tony Blair was being told, and also based upon the fact that we knew that Saddam had used chemical and biological weapons in the past, and also based on the fact that Tony Blair did see the closeness of our relationship with the United States as being a fundamental national strategic interest. But I can also see, one, why people thought it was the wrong decision, and I can also see why people look at it in retrospect with hindsight and think you could have handled that a lot better than you did.
Yeah. Since the Iraq War, since the global financial crisis, we've just seen this trust in government continue to erode. What's gone wrong with politics, and why is this declining trust such a global phenomenon?
I mean, I think, look, my last book was all about this. It's really, you know, the subtitle is how has politics gone so wrong, and how can you fix it? I think the crash was the big thing, and the reason that I think that is because I think that's what opened the door to populists who've been around for quite a while, presenting themselves as the friends of the people against the elite. But what happened with the crash is that, essentially, it confirmed this idea that the bankers and the politicians had completely screwed up and created this terrible crisis. The bankers didn't pay a price and the people did. And that allowed the populist politicians who have got no interest in providing solutions to come along and exploit that problem. I also think, to be absolutely honest, I know your background in media, my background in media, I think the way that the media has developed in recent decades, the sort of constant denigration of public life, the constant degradation of politics, and also politicians not doing a very good job at defending themselves as a breed. So that, you know, both in your country and in mine, most of what you see as politics is politician A puts forward a plan, politician B from the other side says it's the most stupid idea there's ever been, and vice versa. And what we've tried to do in the podcast, to be honest, is actually to try and develop the idea that that's not where most people live their political lives anymore. But I think it's a combination of the spread of, you see, populism wouldn't spread unless there was a kind of a fertile ground for it to spread. And what the populists have also then done, they've used I talk about the 3 Ps, populism, polarisation and post-truth. I think the 3 go together very, very well. Social media has flared up the polarisation quite well. And post-truth has been an incredible phenomenon for me because, you know, like I said earlier, we got accused of lying. I know we didn't lie. But now we have politicians who lie and get away with it. Yeah. And I think that is a relatively new phenomenon. But what it says, it also says something about the public, that they hate it on one level, but they don't mind it on the other.
They soak it up, really.
Yeah. So, and that's what's got us in this absolutely incredible situation where Trump, who's a total liar, absolute charlatan, and could come back. Incredible.
Do you see a pathway for politicians in this environment, and with a public that's kind of so open to the 3 Ps you articulated? Is there a pathway for politicians to have a more positive style of leadership?
I think there is, because I actually think that there's a very, one of the, sorry to keep banging on about books, but I wrote a book called Winners about 9 years ago now, and it was about what politics could learn from business and sport, and vice versa. And one of the best quotes in it was from Arsene Wenger, the manager of Arsenal. And he said this thing, which I thought was really wise. He said, we've gone from a vertical world to a horizontal world. In the vertical world, leaders sat at the top, made decisions, and the decisions worked their way down through the system. In the horizontal world, the leader is surrounded by noise created by others all the time. And the response has been to be ever more tactical, because you deal with this bit of noise, that bit of noise. And he said the response should be to be ever more strategic. And I think the problem with a lot of our politicians today is that they're just very, very tactical. There is a place. Look, okay, take Angela Merkel in Germany. Okay, her reputation's been marked down in recent years because of the Putin, Ukraine, dependence on Russian oil, etc. But if you look at her career as Chancellor, winning 4 terms, she wasn't one of these new leaders. She was leading with detail and respect and dignity and all the things that we say we want from leaders. I also think Macron in France, although he's in a bit of trouble at the moment and not as popular as he was, but he kind of came out of nothing with a very positive vision. So it doesn't have to be that the populists win every time. We've just had Donald Tusk in Poland, who I would argue here with I think Morrison was a bit of a 3P leader. Not as bad as Johnson, but, the same breed. And he's gone, beaten by something else. Now, so I think politicians are way, way too defensive about themselves, about what they do. And funny enough, I've just been doing an event with the Brain and Mind Centre, and the New South Wales Mental Health Minister, Rose Jackson, was there. And one of the questions was, somebody said, you said to her, are you ever tempted just to say to when people say to you, well, what are you going to do about it? Are you ever tempted to say, what are you going to do about it? And she said, well, no, I'd never say that. But I didn't jump in. But actually, I think we do need to say that a bit. I think, you've got to say to people, well, okay, one of the questions at this event was somebody complaining about the way the media cover mental health. And I said, well, why'd you read it? Don't read it. That would hurt them. And likewise, I think sometimes in politics, actually saying to people, look, politicians can't do everything. Governments can't do everything. And what's happened is the old model, essentially, is the politician stands up and says, vote for me and I'll give you everything you want. And then it doesn't happen. So you create disillusion. I think the public are ready for politicians who stand up and say, vote for me and I'll give you leadership. Vote for me and I'll focus on priorities. Vote for me and I'll have a plan to address this, 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 and this. But I can't give you everything. I just think that old model is gone. And yet, maybe I'm wrong because, they're all hanging on to the old model. And then meanwhile, you have these, I do think there's got to be a comeuppance for the liars. I really do. I mean, we've had it. If you think about it, I saw the former French president, François Hollande. I was talking to him recently. He was a guest on the podcast. And he said, I think actually you're not in as bad, he was talking about Britain, but I'm very depressed about Britain at the moment. He said, I think you're not in as bad a place as you think. I said, why is that? He said, I think you've had your peak populism. Brexit and Johnson were your peak populism. We haven't had it yet. And of course, Marine Le Pen could win. The AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, are on the rise in Germany. This guy in Holland, Wilders, has just won the election there. Italy, Meloni, Orban, Hungary, But so you can see it around, but I still think it can be defeated. But it needs confidence. It needs a more positive message than a lot of the progressive politicians are giving out. But then you look at something like America and you think, well, Joe Biden's done a pretty good job. He gets no credit. He gets very little credit for it. And that effing monster's still hanging around like a bad smell could get back in.
Are you encouraged by the success of your podcast, The Rest is Politics, that there is a market and interest in intelligent discourse and divergent views coming together?
Well, it's so... look, it's been a bit of a... I've got to be honest, it's been a bit of a surprise that it's been quite as, popular as it is. I've been around a long time. I left government more than 20 years ago. So I've been kind of on this, doing talking, writing, broadcasting ever since. But this has cut through in a way that Very little I've ever done before has. And I think it is about this thing. We have this motto, disagree agreeably. So we do disagree about stuff, but we try to do it agreeably. We've only had one bad fallout. We have guests on that we try and treat with respect, even though we don't agree with them always. And I think there's something strange happening. I think just as the centre in politics has been kind of hollowed out a bit, I think within the media landscape, the centre's being hollowed out. And so you've got these two very different new forms that have emerged. One is kind of people getting all their news from TikTok or just scrolling on Twitter, which is kind of, just cheap thrill, one story, next story, next story, next story, next story. And then the other is sitting down and listening to something where people try and do things in real depth. And I am encouraged by the fact that, I'll tell you, when we filled out the Albert Hall, we sold the Albert Hall in 9 minutes. And we did some data on the people there, and a third were under 30, which I thought was great, and I go into schools the whole time and try and persuade kids that, I was in this school the other day in I can't remember, somewhere in southern England, and this girl said, and her friends laughed when she asked the question, but I felt really sad. She said, has politics always been this bad? And I said, how old are you? And she said, I think she said 13 or 14. And her first political memory was Boris Johnson. Well, if all you've seen is Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, for you, politics has always been this bad. So actually trying to explain to her, no, you know what, there have been some really good prime ministers down the years, there have been some great ministers, there have been some amazing change, and there still can be. But it's harder in this environment. I kind of remain optimistic. I think, look, to be honest, we either go up or we go right under. And I kind of feel we'll go up at some point.
You have hope.
I do, yeah. And I'll tell you where I get the hope is actually in going to schools. I think a lot of kids have worked this out. They know that what's happening isn't working. I hope that if we get a Labour government, that there'll be an absolute fundamental reassessment of how we do politics. I was in Adelaide last night and I met the Premier there, and he was telling me, for example, he's bringing forward legislation to outlaw political donations. Wow, I thought, great, do it. I honestly think your culture and your democracy really benefits from compulsory voting. I wish we did that. I think political education's a mess. I don't know what it's like here, but in Britain, in England, if you don't do politics at A level from 16 to 18, you get no political education in schools at all. It's hopeless. So where do you get your political education from? The media, which is tendentious, superficial, trivial a lot of the time, or from your parents, who probably sit around the whole time saying, oh, they're all the same, they're all terrible. So where do you get, if you're a young person today, where are you finding any political hope?
Well, you're here in Australia and you're talking about politics. People love to talk politics with you. And you're also talking a lot about mental health, mental health policy. You talk openly about your own experience. Just back to young people, are you worried about the juxtaposition of a political environment that can be very dispiriting and a global environment, climate, everything else that can be so bleak and pessimistic, and mental health issues in society? And so what's the message of hope for young people?
I think the message of hope for young people is that they do have the capacity to make the change. And I can see why a lot of the time they feel that they don't. I write in the book a lot about individual people, a lot of them young women, Greta Thunberg being an obvious one. But also, for example, I write a chapter about a woman called Gina Martin, so Gina Martin was, this is when dealing with this thing about no point getting involved because one person can't make a difference. So what happened, I don't know if you know this story, but she was at a festival and she noticed that these two guys were filming her up her skirt. There were police there because it was a big crowd festival. She said, excuse me, those two guys are following me around filming up my skirt. They'd never had this before. Phoned in and the guy came back and said, look, I'm really sorry about this. Sorry, but there's no law against it. She said, right, well, within a year, there was a law against it.
Yeah.
And she drove that by herself. And when you go through the process of how she did it, I explain to people, It's really hard to make change, but you can do it. And I think that I think there'll come a point where either democracy explodes and it goes, and I genuinely do worry if Trump comes back that could happen, or actually we'll look back at this as a wave of a sort of populist, trivializing, polarizing wave where we were dragged down and then people realized that and then they moved into a different direction. It won't be going back to anything, it'll be going to something different. And I really think that has to be about young people getting their voice and doing it in a way that isn't just about shouting at politicians and isn't just about, it's about them actually having ideas about how you can make change.
In your advocacy for, funding and programs around mental health, you've spoken so honestly about your own experiences. You've talked a bit about it today, but, there's lots of your writing and lots of your speaking talking about it. Has that been a deliberate decision that that's what you feel you want to do, that's what you feel you have a responsibility to do? And are there any times where you think, I just don't want to talk about this anymore?
No, I've never, ever. I like talking about mental health. I think I actually said at the event today that my one worry is I think both here in Australia and in the UK, I think we've had a lot of success on the awareness front. But one of the problems with that is we've made more people aware, but then they've all thought, oh yeah, well I feel a bit ill, I'll go and see a doctor, and they find there's no services there. We've now got to do the same on services, and we've got to do the same on prevention as well. But no, I've always felt very, very comfortable about it. Partly it goes back to the point I made about what the atmosphere was like in the Daily Mirror back when I went back after my breakdown. People were really, really supportive, and they helped me realise actually there's no problem about being open with this. It's fine, and I've never, ever, ever regretted that. I do feel I feel a sense of responsibility. I think is that I've got a lot of, so I've all the skills that I've developed in journalism and in politics and in campaigning and so forth. I sort of feel that mental health is where I feel can be applied best in a funny sort of way, because in the end it is about language. It's about how we address the issue through how we speak about it, how we talk about it, how we campaign on it. And then the other thing is, I had my own issues, but I also had a brother, Donald, who had schizophrenia, and he's the real reason I campaign on this, because I was saying to the event today at the Brain and Mind Centre that so my dad was 82 when he died, and Donald was 62 when he died. The average lifespan of somebody who spends an adult life on antipsychotic medication is 20 years lower than you and I. And that's just so wrong. So I think that, whether it's about awareness, whether it's services, but that's a research question. We haven't really changed the medications on mental illness for a long, long time.
Yeah, so it strikes me that when you look at the sophistication and the precision of, say, cancer medications now in personalised medicine, the treatment of mental health, as far as medication is concerned, just seems a century behind.
Well, look at what happened with COVID. I mean, when the world had to, it did.
Yeah.
And we've got a vaccine. Similarly, when we had to, I don't know if you had the same here, but in the UK, when COVID happened, suddenly, because people were getting worried that these poor people living on the streets might actually have COVID and give it to me walking by them, we found places for them to live.
Yeah. So why can't mental health get higher up the government priority list, medical research funding? Why is it still such a battle?
Because two reasons, I'd say. One is because the other pressures are so monumental. But secondly, I think the getting rid of stigma and taboo, it takes time. I think we're getting there. I also think we haven't won the argument that over time this is a kind of money saver as well as a life saver. I think that, well, if Labour get in, I'm really pleased that one of the things they're going to do, they're going to put these mental health hubs into schools. And I think if we could just think about everyone, not everyone's mentally ill, but everyone has mental health. And just as we try and teach our kids to look after their physical health by running around and eating well and all that, we've got to do the same for mental health. But also, to be honest, it does take leadership, and it takes, funny enough, one of the high points for the mental health debate in the UK was actually when David Cameron was Prime Minister, because we'd started this thing, this Time to Change campaign, which is a bit like You're Beyond Blue. And Cameron really supported it, partly because Nick Clegg was the Deputy Prime Minister and it was one of his big things. You do need political leaders who are going to say, this matters, this is a priority. And I keep saying to politicians tend to describe everything as a priority. If they look it up in the dictionary, priority means more important than other things. And so it will only happen when they say this mental health stuff is more important than other things. But I think it is, because ultimately, Ian Hickey did a presentation today where he was pointing out the stats on suicide in Australia. It's the same in the UK. They're horrific. They're right at the top. If that was any other, if you deleted suicide and put any other illness that was having that effect on people's lives and cost, and so it'd get fixed.
So do you think there's still a taboo issue there? You speak very openly and honestly about these things. What is it around mental illness, mental health?
People are scared.
Scared of what?
Well, that's where taboo comes from. People, you have a taboo when you have a fear. So like when I was a kid, and you'll remember this, we didn't call cancer, we called it the big C. Why did we call it the big C? Because we didn't want to call it what it was. Why didn't we want to call it what it was? Because it was scary. I remember my mum once sitting us down at the kitchen table and saying that one of our neighbours said, Mr. Whittaker, he's got cancer. You mustn't tell anybody. Now, if you think about, you mentioned earlier about cancer treatments and cures that are sort of now around. If cancer had always stayed as the big C, you wouldn't have had the success that you'd have. So I think we're in the kind of big C phase still. So it's fear. I think a lot of that fear is in employment. I think people are really scared in the workplace of being open. They think it will be held against them, including, by the way, in the healthcare systems, which is where you think it shouldn't be like that. But I know people in the healthcare systems who say, I wouldn't dream of telling my boss. But we've got to get rid of that. If somebody comes to you, I'm now a bit of a sort of positive discriminator. If I see two identical sort of, CVs and, same degree, same gap year, same this, same that, same interest, but one of them has got a few months that have gone missing, and maybe they were in a treatment centre, or maybe they're in prison, I'm going to go for that one. Because I just think, what do we want out of people? We want honesty, and we want resilience.
Resilience, yeah.
And,
that demonstrates it.
Yeah.
So what does it feel like when you're experiencing depression?
I think everybody's different, but there was somebody who was on the panel today who said that when she gets depressed, it's like walking through sludge 24 hours a day. With me, it's like a cloud, but it's sort of, and it comes in, and I can feel it coming in, and then it gets into me, and it sort of fills my veins, and my legs feel like lead, and I feel sad. I feel very, very sad, but it's worse than sad. It's like I know I'm alive, I'm breathing, I can see things, I can eat, I can drink, I can walk, but I feel dead. It's like feeling dead, but you're living. When it's bad, it's truly horrible. And the thing is that you feel like, even though you've been through it before, when it strikes like that, you think, oh, this is it. This is the last. This is it forever now. This one is going to be, and that's why I understand why people get driven to suicide when you have that such an intense feeling. And that's when I have, not least thanks to the jam jar, I have actually been able now to build on the sense of, oh, I've been through this before. It's going to end. It's going to end. I'll get through this. Yeah.
How do you keep on top of things yourself, your own depression? You're working incredibly hard. You're cranking out, more than a book a year, big podcasts, speaking engagements around the world. How do you manage the busyness and staying on top?
Well, I don't always manage it very well, is the truth. Partly, I don't know really, partly by keeping fit. Physical exercise, I think, is really important. I'm obsessed with sleep. I really
Do you monitor it? Do you
I don't
get your own
monitor it,
data?
no, I don't do that.
You just know you need sleep.
I just know I need to get to bed early. And if I'm not sleeping well, I need to calm down and not do too much.
Because that's a triggering sign for you.
It can be, yeah, it can be. And I have sort of like the depressions that I get come on. They can come on quite suddenly, but I'm kind of aware of them coming on.
Yeah.
But then I've also got to be very careful when I've never been diagnosed with bipolar, but I get very manic at times. And I'm incredibly creative and I've got unbelievable energy, but I've really got to watch that as well. So both of those things, I've got to watch them.
Do you believe you haven't been diagnosed because you haven't pursued it, or is that a diagnosis you have in your own head about you?
I think I've been diagnosed,
Yeah.
and I've got depression. I get depression, but the psychiatrist, I saw a psychiatrist for a long time, and he said, I don't think you're bipolar, but you get very bad depression, and so he would argue that other people might define as my manic is actually me most of the time,
Right.
and that's about energy.
Yeah.
But I had this wonderful experience in Canada. I did a TV documentary. Well, I did a TV documentary and then a book about my depression. And the idea from the BBC, you like this because I know you're big in telly. And so the BBC came and said, we want you to do a documentary on depression. We want you to travel around the world, go wherever you want, talk to different people about how they deal with their depression, doctors, scientists, researchers, etc. And then our dream, is that you find something that you didn't know about, and you do it, and you explore it, and then, hey presto, your depression's gone, and the final scene is I'm walking into the sunset, and I throw my antidepressants over my shoulder, etc. Anyway, that didn't happen. What did happen is that I met a woman in Canada who was a geneticist, and I was exploring the idea of whether it's hereditary. And anyway, she said, no, it's not, basically. More complicated than that. But after we stopped filming, she said, how do you deal with your depression then? Said to me. And I said, oh, well, I see a psychiatrist and I take medication. Oh, she said, because I get, and I'm normally good at spotting if people who've got depression. Didn't read it with her at all. She said, oh, that's interesting, because I get really bad depression. Oh, said he, surprised. I said, how do you deal with it? And she said, I've got a jam jar. And this became the climax of the film, because I didn't know what she was talking about, but I woke up in the middle of the night and I filmed myself on my phone doing the jam jar exercise. So she basically said, look, there's your jam jar. I'll use the bottle because it's got less water in it. There's the jam jar, and down in the bottom, that's your genes.
Yeah.
Okay? And in the jam jar, that's sediment. Nothing you can do about it. Nothing you can do about genes. The rest of the jam jar is your life. And it fills up with good experiences and bad experiences. And normally we cope. Most of the time, normally we cope. But then whenever it gets out of control, the jam jar explodes, and that's when we're ill. And she said, we spend all our time trying to fix this stuff down here. And there's nothing wrong with therapy and do that, but you can't undo it. What you can do is grow the jam jar so you can put more of life into it. And I didn't really know what she was talking about, but then it clicked a few days later, and I now use the jam jar. And what it is that I use it as a sort of working tool. I travel with it, and if I'm starting to feel
a physical jam
yeah,
jar.
it's a jam jar.
Yeah.
And if I'm starting to feel depressed, I look at it, and I see the sediment, and there's the life, and then I build on it all the things that I know have helped me. So the first thing is FFF, Fiona Family Friends. Okay, if my key relationship is strong, I'm better. If I'm getting on with kids, I'm better. If my friends are around, I'm better. Next one is meaningful activity. Both work to make a living, but work to change the world. Then my fundamentals, which are sleep, diet, exercise. Then the stuff that matters to me, Burnley Football Club, bagpipe music, my dog, my bike. Then the thematic stuff, curiosity, creativity. And what was really interesting about it is that when I was doing it, drawing it in the middle of the night, I hadn't even mentioned psychiatry and medication. And they came like up here. So now when I'm feeling it going on, I just think, right, I'm going to tune in today. Some days I can't do it because I'll be so depressed I can't get out of bed. But if I'm on a sort of not terrible depression, but I'm declining, I go through every single one of them every day, and I just try and tick them off. Listen to music, not the news. Read books, not newspapers. Think of somebody you've not spoken to for a while. Reach out to them. Tell them what's going on. Be open, be honest. And, you know, it could be coincidence, but my depression's been a lot better since I got my jam job.
Since the jam job.
Yeah.
Alastair Campbell, thanks so much for joining us here at the University of
Pleasure.
Sydney and on the Solutionists podcast.
Thank you.